GMTK Game Jam 2021, an event where game developers from all over the globe go head to head to create the best video game in 48 hours. If you're unfamiliar with how your typical game jam goes, it's something like this. At the beginning of the allotted time, a theme is announced. All developers must incorporate this theme inside of their games in some way or another. This year, I decided I was going to compete in this challenge, and this time I'd do it solo. You see, GMTK allows for people to group up and create games in a team, which in my opinion seriously shifts the chances of winning over to those teams of 4 with 10+ years experience on them, but you know, it's all for fun. So needless to say, I didn't really have winning in mind, seeing as there was 5,000 participants, and as I mentioned, some of those were teams. I did have my own goals though. To explain them, I'll have to go back around a year and a half. On February 2nd, 2020, my pal Sam Hogan released this video where he made a game for a game jam. It wasn't GMTK, but it was a game jam nonetheless. In my opinion, this is one of the greatest game jam entries of all time, but don't take my word for it. Sam created a puzzle game that uses incredibly simple art, sounds and gameplay, yet somehow manages a liminal vibe while playing as well as an encapsulating experience. So why am I telling you this? Well, I knew for GMTK that I wanted to attempt something similar. I wanted to make a game that used a combination of basic assets and still produced a result that was fun to play and a memorable experience. So as hyped up as ever, I joined the live stream ready for the theme announcement. This live stream had 8,000 people watching. It was oddly comforting to know that even though I'd be losing sleep this weekend, 8,000 other people would be too. The theme is join together. Needless to say, some of us were more happy than others.
Oh, why is that?
Usually at this point, I'd go off and brainstorm different ideas on a whiteboard. However, for some reason this time, I knew exactly what I wanted to make. The basic idea was there'd be 2 players, you could only control one of them at a time, and there'd be a moving wall behind you that slowly presses you to move forward. If it touches either of the players, then the level will reset. However, I wanted to design the puzzles in a way where both players would be paramount to finishing a level. So, player A might have to help player B by opening a door, for example. And with that, it was time to start the jam. Seeing as it's what I'm most comfortable with, I chose 3D this time and booted into Unity. Seeing as I needed to use every minute efficiently, I decided I'd start with the essential mechanics and slowly add in less important ones as time went on. This way I wouldn't overscope and end up having a really feature-rich half-finished mess. Objectively, the most important mechanic in the whole game is the player switching. So I set up a demo scene and added 2 cylinders to act as the players for now, both different colours. And to finish it off, I then spent 5 minutes coding up a super simple movement system. There's a few ways I could whip up the switching mechanic. Number 1 is we have 2 players, each with their own separate movement class, and we enable/disable them at will. While this approach is probably easier, I opted for a different method. Whenever our player decides they want to switch, the currently active version will be moved to where the inactive version is, and the inactive version will be moved back to where the active version was, thereby creating the illusion that the player has switched. As you can see, the only real issue at the moment is that the inactive player doesn't have any physics. So on top of swapping the positions, they're also going to swap their velocities. Another thing we need to swap is the player colors to sell the illusion that the player is actually switching and not teleporting. But to be honest, I felt pretty ahead and didn't want to risk waking up late. So I took the decision to head to bed and work on that in the morning.
It's so early. Alexa, what time is it?
It's 5:17 a.m.
It's 5 a.m.
So the first task for day 2 was fixing the material switching from the night before. It didn't take too long to get that up and running. To be honest, that's pretty much the main mechanic of the game in its bare bones state, so I decided to write down some of the other stuff I wanted to get done. Seeing as the entire game pretty much revolves around that switching mechanic, I created an event that fires every time the player teleports. This means in other classes we can execute whatever logic we want, provided that the logic is subscribed to this event. A good example of this is a camera animation. We can first create the animation inside of a method and subscribe that method to the teleport event. So each time we call the event, the camera will play the animation, and as you can see, it works perfectly. This was pretty much enough to start working on the first level. I was very inspired by Portal 2 Co-op's level design and how some chambers they completely cut off both players from each other. So I decided boxing out a basic design for the first level and placing in some simple props like windows. Just after I'd finished boxing out a little test arena, GMTK tweeted this. So I thought I'd share my progress with the world. Needless to say, I had now asserted utter dominance over all other contestants, so the intimidation factor was at an all-time high. So with my newfound alpha status, I created a few more walls that I could reuse throughout the game, including a wall with a gap, wall with a window, and just a plain old wall. Currently, the game doesn't have much potential for puzzles. You can run around and teleport, but that's about it. So it's time to add in some interactables. The first interactable I made was a door, but obviously currently it's more of a weird wall, seeing as there's no way to open it. So the next job was creating an interaction system for the player. For all non-programmers, I'm going to try and explain this in a way that won't make you spam the L key on your keyboard. Presumably, we're going to want different types of buttons and different types of interactables. So all buttons will house an event called onButtonPress that we inherit from a parent class. And all of the interactables contain some logic that subscribes to that button's event. You know, for example, if it's a door, the logic inside of that method is going to be to lift the door up. Then we just assign each interactable its own button and tell it to subscribe. And then each type of button can call the event when it's relevant. For example, a pressure pad would call it when the player stands on it and tell its interactable to perform its interaction. This is super scalable and allows us to create whatever type of button or interactable that we want with ease. So onto actually making the buttons. I wanted the door from earlier to be opened when a standing button was pressed, so we need a standing button. I modeled it in Blender, hooked up the door to the button, and as you can see when I press it, it opens the door. I'm going to stop working on the interactables now because they're super easy to add if and when we need them. To be honest, at the moment the game's looking kind of trash, so I decided to bake some lights and it looks kind of sick. However, seeing these lights made me want to flesh out the game even more, so I worked on adding some sound effects like footsteps and door sounds. One mechanic I really liked the idea of adding was a bow and arrow with a target to interact with things. Why a bow and arrow? I don't know, they're kind of sick. So I modeled up a bow and got that in game, then I worked on creating a little animation for the bowstring when you're about to fire, and then finally added the actual shooting mechanic. Once again, it was the end of the day, so I went to bed and picked everything back up in the morning.
Okay, so it's currently around 9:07 AM. I'm just getting started for the day, and we currently have so much to get done. It's unbelievable. So it's going to be a bit of a grind, and not only on top of all this, but we've also got to make levels.
Day 3 was going to be about building levels. The only other thing than that to really do was add the bow pickups and some sound effects. So I thought it would be smart to start with those. I won't bore you with the details, but here it is working. Alright, finally it's time to work on levels. The level we currently have is going to be the tutorial. There's no moving wall yet, so it's a danger-free way to learn the mechanics. I added in some basic text to guide the player to the exit, and that was pretty much it. If the player shoots the bow and misses this button, they have no way to activate the door. So I made sure that if the player misses, then there will be a restart screen that comes up. One more thing the tutorial needs is a way to end the game. I made this simple setup with 2 buttons that ends the current level when both players are standing on one of the buttons. And then finally, I added a timer to give the game a sense of pace. Over the next few hours, I made a few more levels, added the moving wall, added some lava. I don't really want to reveal everything, seeing as I want you to go away and actually play the game, but I'll quickly show you the full tutorial before moving on. If you're interested, by the way, that music was made by my good friend Justin. He makes a lot of music for my games, so if you do get the chance, be sure to check out his stuff in the description. Alright, with only around 40 minutes to go, I needed to get the game packaged up and submitted to the jam. I made some art for the itch page inside of Photoshop, and once happy, went to submit the game. Unfortunately, with 10 minutes remaining, disaster struck. So I literally have 10 minutes to submit, and itch.io has gone down. It is now 1 minute before the deadline, and I still don't have my game up. But then when all hope was lost, GMTK tweeted this. I managed to submit before the deadline and the game was done. Alright guys, it's the 16th of June today, which means the jam's been ended for about 4-ish days, and I just wanted to take a look at some of the responses. One thing that a lot of people agreed on is that the bow and arrow mechanic wasn't the best, and I have to completely hold my head up. It's not the best. The arrow doesn't necessarily go straight towards the center of the screen, which is for me not too bad because I designed it and I played around with it and I learned how to use it. But for a new player, especially in a game jam, that's not the best. People want to get in and get out as quickly as possible, so having to actually learn a mechanic is kind of infuriating, especially when the mechanic isn't implemented in the best way. On top of that, people said that they didn't like the difficulty of the game. Now obviously I designed the game to be difficult,
which is definitely not a good idea for a game jam because people will just take that badly. Essentially what I'm trying to say is the game is terrible. It's a fun game, but it's definitely designed for a certain type of person. So, you know, if you enjoy speedrunning games that are pretty difficult and take a lot of time to sort of get down, then this game's perfect for you. But unfortunately, most game developers don't enjoy that type of game. So I don't think the game's going to do too well. But if you guys do want to play it, then there will be a link in the description.